In less than 10 months, Americans will head to the polls to determine the fate of our country yet again. Friday, President Biden delivered a fiery speech on the fields of Valley Forge the day before the anniversary of the Capitol insurrection, reminding Americans this election year is a battle for the future of American democracy.
This is the first national election since January 6th. Insurrection placed a dagger at the throat of American democracy since that moment. We all know who Donald Trump is. The question we have to answer is, who are we?
Joining me now is Nina Smith, Democratic strategist and former congressman from Florida, and MSNBC political analyst Carlos Curbelo. A great way for me to dive into politics on a Sunday morning. Carlos, I'd love to start with you. Trump campaign in Illinois submitting ballot paperwork for Donald Trump. He refuses to sign the loyalty oath where candidates pledge to not overthrow the government. Apparently, Trump signed that in 2016 and 2020, but refuses to do it now. Is this a sign that he's either starting to read the documents that he's signing or that he will not promise to overthrow the government?
Katie, this is Donald Trump reminding us of who he is. How did he mark the 6th of January, that horrible anniversary, right? 3 years ago, we saw what happened at the Capitol. He doubled down on his lies. I mean, this is who Donald Trump is, and you can count on him to be very honest and transparent about who he is. The question now is whether the majority of Americans will believe him or not, right? And certainly some of the polling we've seen lately is somewhat disconcerting. But Donald Trump is telling us again, he said a few weeks ago, he'd be willing to be dictator, at least for a day, right? Here he is again saying that he will not honor the Constitution of the United States. No surprises from Donald Trump.
And yet he likes to hide behind the Constitution of the United States when it fits him legally. Nina, I'd like to turn to you. It's not just Donald Trump that is a GOP stumbling fool. It's going to be Vivek Ramaswamy as well. He had to say this last night at a rally in Iowa. Take a quick listen.
And, you know, the unspoken reality in all of this is that she's a black woman. And that's the uncomfortable truth here. And it's an uncomfortable truth because in this case, it's clear she got her job because of her race and gender. I just have to say it out loud because we have to address a problem. You got to speak the truth about it. Claudine Gay was to Harvard as Kamala Harris is to Harvard, as Kamala Harris is to the Democratic Party, actually. Right? When somebody gets their job with utter incompetence, I mean, in Kamala Harris's case, it's like the equivalent of Claudine Gay at Harvard for her papers that she's writing.
I mean, Nina, there's a lot to say about Vivek Ramaswamy, but this, I think, is one of the most overt examples of him embracing not only misogyny, but racism, and it's coming from Vivek Ramaswamy, of all people.
Well, I mean, you know, it just goes to show where he's standing in this race. He's desperate for attention and is constantly yelling on the debate stage, yelling to try and insert himself into a conversation where, you know, no one's really paying attention. I would say that, you know, this is indicative of something that we've been seeing from the entire Republican field. We're seeing a lot of Diet Trump, and, you know, the American people, particularly Republicans, are not interested. They're not, you know, looking to engage with someone who is constantly yelling at them or, you know, insulting credentialed professionals like Kamala Harris and Claudine Gay. You know, but this situation with regard to Claudine Gay is unfortunate, but Vivek Ramaswamy is the last person to be talking about the qualifications of these two individuals who are facing all sorts of attention and attacks, but not necessarily the credit for the work they have done. So I'll say that to Vivek.
So, Carlos, let's talk about Nikki Haley, who's also still in the mix. I mean, if you want to call that, she's not super viable at this point. Nikki Haley is struggling, though. So I was having this conversation with my team, actually, this week about the fact that now that the spotlight has shifted heavily on Nikki Haley because she's, quote, risen in the polls, she seems to be stumbling even more, not only from her completely horrific non-answer on Civil War slavery, but even to the idea that she would entertain DeSantis as her running mate, to which DeSantis said, what? Who? No. I mean, so does Nikki Haley kind of say, you know what, the more exposure that she's getting, the more kind of in the spotlight she is, the actually worse that she's becoming?
Yeah, Katie, I mean, it's a shame for her because she had been climbing steadily in the polls, and we see that she's within striking distance in New Hampshire. I mean, despite some of these recent gaffes, there is a scenario under which Nikki Haley could win in New Hampshire or at least make it very close going into South Carolina after that. But it really does seem that as the spotlight has shifted to her, she has stumbled. And getting attention is good, but as we've seen, the Donald Trump copycats don't work in the Republican Party, nowhere apparently. And getting this kind of attention hasn't been good for Nikki Haley. She really has to regain her footing ahead of Iowa so that hopefully for her, she can have a strong showing in New Hampshire and perhaps make this a two-person race.
Yeah, but Nina, to Carlos's point, actually Donald Trump is now doing campaign spend in New Hampshire, spending money to be able to do attack ads against Nikki Haley. Is that a sign that there is maybe some small Achilles heel for Donald Trump's lead in front of the other candidates?
Well, I mean, that certainly could be the case. I think Donald Trump wants to solidify his position as the front runner in this race. And part of that is shoring up his 20-point lead, I believe it is, in New Hampshire. In order to win and wrap this primary up very quickly so that he can focus on his many court cases, but also the general election that he's facing against President Biden. And so it makes total sense for him to make a little bit of a spend and do what he can to lock this primary up as quickly as possible.
So, Carlos, let's talk about Joe Biden, that incredible speech that we heard, Valley Forge. One of the best speeches that we've heard come out of Joe Biden. But the notable difference was, up until now, Biden's kind of been like, let's talk about Biden. Let's talk about the Biden administration. It's some wonderful accomplishments. Let's kind of, maybe give a little bit to Donald Trump, but not cede a lot of ground. But it was a heavily focused speech about the threat of Donald Trump to American democracy. Is this what we're seeing in 2024 as we get closer to November?
Well, Katie, the speech is important for historical purposes because we do have to remember what January 6th was about and why it happened. However, the strategy, the shift in strategy from President Biden and his campaign are also very important. If this election is going to be a referendum on the Biden administration, it could go either way. If it's a choice between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, assuming Trump does become the Republican nominee, then Biden's chances are a lot better. And all we need to do is look back at the last three general elections, 2018, 2020, and 22. There exists a coalition of Americans who have rejected Donald Trump and his movement, principally because of Donald Trump's lies about elections and everything he did to try to overturn the 2020 election. So Joe Biden is trying to shift the focus, put the spotlight on Donald Trump, remind the American people of who Donald Trump is. And by the way, as I said earlier, Donald Trump will do a good job of that himself. If he does become the nominee, as he gets more attention, he is going to continue revealing who he is. He's going to continue reminding people of who he is. And that's probably good news for Joe Biden and his campaign.